Welcome to Salt Lake City's Redistricting and Fair Representation Ask Me Anything. I'm Haley from the Mayor's Office, and I'll be your host and moderator for the next hour. I had the opportunity to manage Salt Lake City's 2020 Census Outreach campaign and spent a year encouraging Salt Lake City residents to participate in the census. We now have the crucial census data that will determine our political representation and how hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funding is spent over the next decade. Our goal here today is to ensure you have the knowledge and motivation to participate in the redistricting process that is currently happening. Redistricting happens once every 10 years, following the completion of the US Census. Congressional, state legislative, and school district boundaries are redrawn in accordance to the population shift. The goal of redistricting is to ensure a balance and that every boundary and new district is equal in population so that every voice has a chance to be heard and fairly represented. Our panel today features local experts that will share fascinating updates about Salt Lake City's new demographics and ways you can participate in the redistricting process and ensure your voice is heard. Welcome, panel. We're going to do quick introductions, and let's start with Mallory.
I'm Mallory Bateman. I'm a senior research analyst and the state data center coordinator over at the Kemsey Gardner Policy Institute. And so I'm your local boots on the ground census expert.
Hi, my name is Katie Wright. I'm the executive director of Better Boundaries. We are a 501c4 bipartisan organization that had the initiative Prop 4 passed, and so we're huge believers in independent redistricting.
My name is Gordon Haight, and I'm the executive director of the Independent Redistricting Commission, and our effort is to redraw 12 maps to submit to the legislature for their consideration that include the state Senate, the state House, the state school board, and the congressional districts.
Thank you. Also, as a reminder, we will be taking questions from the public in the Facebook comment section of this video, so we can answer them live. So please make sure you submit your questions and we will get to them. Oh, and we'd also like to welcome Salt Lake City Council Chair Amy Fowler. Welcome, Council.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Council Chair Fowler, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Amy Fowler, and I am currently the Salt Lake City Council Chair. I represent District 7 in Salt Lake City, which is basically the Sugar House Country Club area. And, you know, I'm really excited about this discussion. I think it's important that we get all of the input from our residents about redistricting and how important redistricting is and how important people's input is about redistricting. So thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And that's it.
Thank you. So our first question goes to Mallory. What does the new 2020 census data reveal about Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County?
So for Salt Lake City, we're the biggest we've ever been as a resident of Salt Lake City. So we hit 199,723 people. We added about just over 13,000 new residents. One fun fact is all of that growth came from the over 18 population. We actually had a decline in the number of under 18 residents of about 5,000 people. So we had more over 18. And that turns into about 7% growth. And I'll just say that compared with other parts of Salt Lake County, that 7% is just minimal. Even though we added a lot of people, it's a small amount. And then we continue to diversify racially and ethnically. So it was 2/3 of our population was identified as white in 2010, and now we're a little under that at 63%. And over 2/3, so flipping it a little, over 2/3 of our growth, so those 13,000 new residents, identify as a racial or ethnic minority. So those are kind of top level things. We were the fastest growing state, so that's kind of exciting. We made that national headline. And another just kind of trend that I'll throw out that was in the national data and we saw here as well was that neighboring cities to big kind of city centers, so like Salt Lake, got a shout out because South Jordan was one of the fastest growing communities. Boise had Meridian was one of the fastest growing communities in the US. So kind of those neighboring areas to our existing city center capital had a lot of growth where we grew a lot, but just due to how things are, it's not quite as much.
I can't believe we didn't reach the 200,000 mark, but that's a huge growth for Salt Lake City. And how does the diversity that is coming into the county and the state, how will that impact Salt Lake City and the redistricting as a whole?
I'll frame it as just data and I'll let Katie or Gordon talk about the redistricting, but I mean, our population is changing. If you look at our big cities, we are the 8th lowest share of just non-Hispanic white population. So all of those cities that have more than us are, or townships, because I think a couple aren't technically cities, but our communities in Salt Lake County, kind of the established communities are racially and ethnically diverse, and that continues to grow and change. West Valley, more than half of the population identifies outside of non-Hispanic white. Kearns bumped over into that as well. So places like that have a lot, we have a lot going on in this racial and ethnic population lens. Some of those faster growing areas, so Southern Salt Lake County and Northern Utah County, those communities grew a lot during the last decade, and they've got some different dynamics in their racial and ethnic composition. So Salt Lake City is part of kind of a unique cluster of areas in the state that are a little bit more racially and ethnically diverse than kind of the other areas.
Great. I think like census data comes out every 10 years and the redistricting process looks different than it did in 2010. What's different about our 2020 redistricting? And that's gonna, be the trend for the next 10 years. And this can go to Katie or Gordon or Council Chair Fowler, anyone who wants to answer.
Sure, I'll jump in. I think that from a redistricting process standpoint, the big difference in Utah this year, of course, is the existence of the Independent Commission. So just to kind of break it down, in Utah, we have a parallel process. We have a legislative redistricting committee, and we have an independent redistricting commission. And as Gordon mentioned, the commission is tasked with following a robust set of criteria whose purpose is really to increase representation and reduce gerrymandering, and create 12 maps, 3 of each of the 4 types of districts that they then recommend to the legislative committee. And ultimately, state lawmakers have the responsibility to adopt maps. And so we have this hybrid process right now. One of the really good things about the process is it gives regular Utahns a lot of avenue for giving input, which I know we'll get to later in it. And I think what's really important is also to draw a distinction between the 2 process of the legislative committee and the independent commission. So just to speak to some of the data that Mallory shared with us, one difference between the committee's process and the commission is that the commission is looking at racial communities and taking that among their many considerations of how they keep communities intact. Whereas the legislative committee is not using that data at all in their consideration process. So that is one difference between the legislative committee and the independent commission.
Gordon, I'm wondering if you can provide some more, differences that the Independent Redistricting Commission, like data processes that they're doing versus the legislative committee. And just kind of giving everyone a better understanding of why do we have 2 and, what is ultimately like the maps that will, whose maps are going to be the final say.
Okay, yeah, so I think one of the real advantages you have with the independent commission is that we've opened up the process in a way that allows residents and people to be intimately involved in. And let me just describe it a little bit, is that we have 7 members on the commission, and we have 3 that were selected by the Democratic leadership in the legislature, and 3 that were selected by the Republican leadership in the legislature, and then 1 that was appointed by the governor. And we've split up into 3 teams. So there's a Republican selected commissioner with a Democratic selected commissioner, and they are drawing maps. And what's making that unique is that we're doing it live on YouTube, so people can watch how mapping is actually done and carried out. And so if you think about it, as you're thinking about your city or your community, while the commissioners are drawing, you can hear the dialogue, watch while they go back and forth and think about where the lines would best be drawn and how that would affect that community. And that's being discussed in a very transparent way. So as people look at the final product, they can have real clarity of why this was done, even if it's not totally the way they want it, or if it's the way they want it, they'll know what were the give and takes that brought that to bear. And so I think understanding how mapping is done is a really big benefit for the public. The legislature's having to do the same thing. We're asking the public that wants to participate in that fashion can do it. And so this I think is bringing a lot more transparency to how this takes place. I don't know if I answered the full question.
No, yeah. Another comparison that I thought was interesting too is that the independent commission is not looking at where political incumbents or current, representatives live, whereas the legislature is factoring in where incumbents live. So and this is just open, question for everybody, but like, what are the benefits of considering where incumbents live, and what are the, setbacks, but also like, what do Salt Lake City's current, district maps look like? I know we're part of, Salt Lake City is one of the most populous cities in the state, but like, what does our representation currently look like?
I'll give you go ahead, Gordon. All right. Oh, you go. Okay, I guess I'm going. Sorry about that. Just some thoughts. I mean, when you talk to the co-chairs of the Legislative Redistricting Committee, they're really frank that they want to know where incumbents live, because they're like, we already know. So if we know, the public should know too, and that's why we have that as a layer of a data set. So that in their kind of, I'm paraphrasing, but that's their statement on that. Whereas on the independent commission, what I've heard from commissioners is we don't want that to influence or bias where we're drawing lines, and that's why we're choosing not to look at that data. But one thing that I think is important for the whole state to understand, but certainly in Salt Lake, that redistricting is really an equal opportunity offending situation, where it is certainly not one party, even in a supermajority state, that does incumbency protection. It is happening everywhere across the whole country, but certainly here in Utah. And so essentially at Better Boundaries, we think about that as a conflict of interest. In business, government, certainly, we all have checks and balances to remove conflict of interest in important decision making. And we think of the independent commission as a check and balance on the inherent conflict that our hardworking, and they are truly hardworking representatives have. And that's why we really believe in the open and transparent process of the independent commission, where there are other standards that take precedent and create really good representation.
And just to follow up on that, I think specifically with Salt Lake City, and we talked about, and I'm going to use kind of round numbers, Salt Lake City roughly hit 200,000 population. And so what does that mean for the residents of Salt Lake City is that it literally could have 2 Senate districts, or it could be split up so that it could have more representatives, but the likelihood that some of those representatives would live outside of the city. Now, there's discussion, is it better to have more representatives even though they may not live in the community, or is it better to have a representative inside the community? Salt Lake City has, it takes about 218,000 population to create a school board member. Right now, Salt Lake City is divided into 3 different districts. Is it better to have it as one district where you're definitely going to have a representative that's elected out of the city, or is it better to have it split up as it is, or even in more ways, so you have more representation? And on the congressional level, Salt Lake City could make up a third of a district. And so it needs to be paired. Should it be paired going north with Davis County? Should it be paired south going with part of Salt Lake County? Salt Lake County has about 1.2 million people. So it's going to have to be split somewhere. That's inevitable. It has to take place. And the discussion is, should, we hear this, we've been to a lot of meetings in rural Utah, and there's been a lot of discussion about having the urban centers paired with rural sections. And I think we've heard that discussion from a rural setting. I think it's important to have that discussion and give feedback, not just to the commission, but also to the legislature committee. What does the urban areas of Salt Lake City, how do they vision the future for the next decade, the best way for them to be represented? So those are some things that I think are very concrete things that Salt Lake City will be affected for the next decade, but can really weigh in on that and give us good feedback.
I'll just throw out a quick data note that Salt Lake City is the biggest city in the state by a lot of people. So that's another thing that separates us from kind of other communities. We have different needs because we're bigger and we have some different things going on. So just a reminder for folks living in Salt Lake, we're a little bit of a different mold, I think, than other places.
Yeah, I mean, currently the majority of Salt Lake City residents are represented by Chris Stewart, the representative for Utah's 2nd congressional district. And as Gordon mentioned, it is that mixture of like rural and urban communities. But like Salt Lake City's interests and concerns, when it's alongside other communities, I mean, like Salt Lake City's in the same congressional district as like Ephraim and Milford. So it's just like, where is that balance? And like, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Council Chair Fowler, like how should Salt Lake City have its own congressional district? And what are your thoughts on that balance between like mixing urban and rural communities together?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, ideally, I think it would be great if Salt Lake City had its own congressional district because our interests are so different. And I think that many of our residents don't necessarily feel that their interests are represented. And I may be speaking out of turn, but just from sort of anecdotally speaking, that I do think that people feel that their congressional representative doesn't always fall in line with what their interests are or needs are as a Salt Lake City resident. That being said, understanding, as Gordon pointed out, that we do kind of have to split it up a little bit. And I think the way that this is why the input from the community is so important, because I think that the way that we should be looking at the maps and the districts are, what are our like-minded interests? What are our cultural values that are in common with other areas, right? With other cities or townships or counties. And kind of, I think what has happened, to your point, Haley, is that when you have Salt Lake City and Ephraim, there may be a lot of differences there between our interests that aren't represented or are sort of split from a congressional representative point of view, right? How do you represent both of those things when they may be very opposite in interests? And I think, again, that's why it's so important. And maybe not, right? There may be areas where we're totally in line with one another, but we just don't know, right? There are still areas in Salt Lake City where we have farming communities, right? And so if you have a farming community in Salt Lake County or Salt Lake City, that may be in line with some of our other, rural community areas that would make sense to have us share a district. But that's why we need that input from our community members and to say, really, what are our goals and values? And let's make sure that those are in line so that we feel represented by whoever is elected to that position.
Well said. It's also, I think, important too that like, I think a lot of folks don't understand, like we're talking about voting districts, school districts, but also city council districts too. So those are changing too. I mean, the city council, Salt Lake City Council is going to be redrawing our district. So like, maybe can you speak to that process too of like what's happening in our own community, over the next couple months and years as well?
Yeah, I think as you may know, the state and county processes have to be completed before the city can do anything with our own redistricting. And I think similarly, I certainly, and I know I feel like I can speak for my other council members, would want to hear from our residents about whether or not they feel that they are in line with other members of their communities. We have to figure it out, but we want residents to feel that they are being represented by the person that is elected for them. And those interests, again, sort of similarly in a congressional, to my answer about our congressional districts, we, in my area, it's very long and narrow going east to west. And so you have a real wide array of socioeconomic differences. And people may have different feelings about being represented by me or any elected official about whether their voice is being heard. And for me, as an elected official, it truly is about making sure that I'm representing the voices of the people that elected me. And all of my residents, whether you voted for me or not, but all of my residents, that I'm being an accurate representation of what our needs for the community are. And so I think going back, it really is important that we hear from community members as we start our process in redistricting so that we're aligning the interests of our community members.
I appreciate that feedback, and I wish everyone who's redrawing the maps currently have the same sentiments for sure. We do have a question from Nettie on Facebook, and this is for everybody. How do you keep political biases limited when you're redrawing the maps? In other words, like how do you not gerrymander these new maps?
Well, I'll take a first step at that and would love to hear Gordon's thoughts. But when that initial proposition was passed and then throughout the negotiation with state lawmakers, there is a whole set of criteria that the independent commission must follow in addition to constitutional requirements. And all of those are meant to reduce political bias and create other considerations. So a shorthand way of remembering that is to think of the C's. So keeping communities intact, cities intact when possible. It's not always possible. Keeping communities of interest intact, using sort of geographic like mountain ranges or man-made major highways as divisions or existing political lines. I mean, these are all ways of reducing gerrymandering and instead centering other standards or other considerations like, an existing city that has sort of built a cultural hub or those sort of things. But it is also important to point out that there is a requirement for the independent commission that they don't undue favor one party or politician. So that is an explicit requirement as well.
And to kind of help that, one of the things we mentioned is that whenever the mapping is taking place, we put one of the selected Republicans and Democrats in the room. So they are working together and you can hear the dialogue and see why they're doing the lines. And it will follow pretty closely that what is the purpose of bringing, Davis County this way or Cache Valley or what they're doing. you'll hear the logic behind it. So it really gives it as transparent, so feel that you can really determine that it's not a politically motivated line that's being drawn in your community. You feel you can understand it. And I think that's always transparency for democracy, or is the way you help keep the system going in the way it should be going. Transparency is always the process.
And can I jump in on this a little bit, Haley? For Salt Lake City, Salt Lake City Council is nonpartisan. And so this does give us a unique position to focus on community identity rather than political affiliations, right? And I think one of the things that is important for me, and I want us to be looking at as we go through this process, is history. To something, I thought about this when Katie mentioned sort of man-made barriers or man-made divides. We also have to remember why those happened and look at, historically speaking, redlining was a way to gerrymander and a way to create discrimination within our communities. And so as we go through our process, I think it's important to keep that in mind and not repeat history, but really challenge those divides and those man-made sort of historical discriminatory lines. And again, because we don't have to look at political affiliations, I think Salt Lake City and a lot of councils that are nonpartisan can really focus on what the community needs are. Businesses, the community identity, neighborhoods, and say, let's make sure that these people's interests and identities and needs are in line with one another.
Yeah, and I think too with this community feedback, so you can provide this feedback to the Independent Redistricting Commission, but what are the ways people can provide it to the legislature? And I would also like to have the audience learn more about like the legislature's maps. And so if they're getting feedback, how do we provide that? But also like, whose maps are going to have the final say? Like, are the maps going to be combined? And, just please speak to, how this process is, the final say and what maps that will be, our district maps for the next 10 years.
So the state legislature is going to have the final say, and they are drawing maps, plus the communities are giving various maps, and then the commission is also going to provide maps. But the ultimate say will be the state legislature, and they have the choice to select any of the commission's maps or any of the maps submitted by the public or the maps they are drawing, or they can make modifications and select hybrids of different maps. So it's 100% clear the legislature is going to do the final selection of the mapping process. And so the kind of thing I wanted to point out is mapping isn't trivial, it's very difficult. And so I think a lot of the public can be intimidated by drawing maps. And so what the commission is hoping to do, what it's trying to do, is allow the public to literally participate and be a participant in the map drawing process without going and learning a very complicated, difficult software and having to go through that process. So this is an opportunity for the people's maps to go to the legislature, and then they can see the comments and the thought process and what was put into that. And so I think giving your information to the legislature is extremely important. Giving it to the commission is extremely important. And so both processes, I would strongly advise people to be involved with both of them. And so hopefully that answered the question that you're asking.
Yes, thank you, Gordon. And we did, along those same lines, we did get another question from Facebook from Lori, and she asks, what can residents do if the legislature ignores the recommendations of the Independent Redistricting Commission? And what are some ways it seems that that they would ignore the voters' initiative that, we passed Prop 4, but they still ignored it. What's going to happen with these new maps?
Yeah, so I'll say that although the current process that we have in place is not what the majority of Utahns voted in, it wasn't thrown out of hand. There was a really good faith negotiation, and we do have an independent commission. And already I could see the really positive impact it has on the dialogue. First, we see more Utahns engaged than ever before. We've had 1,000 maps submitted to the independent commission, and that's really outstanding. And also it's outstanding from a national perspective. So I think the amount of engagement is in part due to this dual process. Additionally, the kind of dialogue and terminology we hear everyone using, from state lawmakers to commissioners to everyday Utahns, is really centering around these ideas of how do you keep communities intact, cities and counties. And so I think that there's been a de-emphasis of like the political yuckiness and a re-emphasis on communities and people and how they want to be represented. So of course I see progress already, and that always makes me hopeful. So I would say, we don't really know what those weeks in November will look like. So from a quick timeline perspective, the Independent Commission delivers and presents their maps to the state legislative committee on November 1st. And so they not only give maps, but they give a whole rationale and narrative of how these maps meet the criteria and the various pros and cons of the different maps that they present. And so that happens November 1st. And then the Legislative Redistricting Committee is scheduled to meet on the 8th and 9th of November. And then there's an interim session kind of around November 14th through 19th or 15th through 20th. I can't remember the exact dates. And we're not sure if the Legislative Committee will put forth draft maps prior to voting and adoption, or what that will look like. So I'll encourage people to be involved now and continually. So to be involved now, comment on the draft maps. Make sure that the Independent Commission maps are something that you want and feel excited about. And then, call your lawmakers and share your voice throughout the process. So that's my advice. And certainly Better Boundaries is working on grassroots organizing statewide so that people know what's happening, they have a voice in it, and we can really tell lawmakers what we're thinking.
And just to kind of piggyback that, is we have a number of maps that are online on our website that the commission has drawn, and even some that the public has drawn. And so everybody can go online, look at those maps, and I guarantee you're going to find maps you absolutely disagree with. But you'll also find maps, I believe, that you're going to say, this really reflects where I think we ought to be going. Or you may see a map with a slight change, or this is really what we want to do. And I think if the public would engage just looking at those maps, and again, you can zoom right in on your house, you can see the detail, and it can give you some really good perspective of what's being thought about. How Salt Lake City, again, you're about 200,000, so you need to pair with another 400,000 people to create a complete congressional district. And which direction does it go out to Tooele, to Park City? Does it go south or north? And those are important distinctions. And again, hearing from Salt Lake City residents, you're the largest city, so having that input is significant. And even in the state representatives, that's about 40,000 people. And so is it better to have, you can have it easily put 4 House districts inside of Salt Lake City, or should they be split and you have more representation? And where should those lines be split? Which communities are we splitting in Salt Lake City? Because we're going to split some. And the more input we have, the more likely we're going to get the splits right. Because the commission's always just struggling, saying, we don't want this community split. This seems to be important. And so having that feedback will help us make sure we get the lines where the residents would like to have those put.
And I was just I know this was a question about the legislature, but just from a local perspective, when it is time for Salt Lake City to look at our redistricting, we will have a resident redistricting commission where people can apply, and then the council will appoint or select commission members. This is the same process we used 10 years ago. And it will be an opportunity really to do just what Gordon is saying and have community input on how we're redistricting and what lines we're looking at. And then to Lori's point about feeling as if sometimes we as voters get ignored. And I'm glad that there is progress, but just a shout out, today is National Voter Registration Day. So make sure that you register and then you can vote the right people in that will help you not feel like your voice is being ignored.
Reminder. Yeah, and we do have another question, like for providing feedback to City Council, to the Commission, to the State Committee, what type of comments are like the most helpful for these commissioners? Is it more of like communities of interest, like, hey, you should keep it based off of, my businesses, or how can people provide the best feedback to ensure that, these maps are fairly drawn?
I think all the above. So one of the things that is important is communities of interest. I mentioned earlier, once you draw a line, maybe I didn't mention, maybe there's another presentation, a community is weakened. You're not able, it's less likely you're going to have somebody elected out of that community. And you draw more lines through that community, it's going to make it statistically impossible for somebody to get voted from that community. And I think that is really, really critical. So we have a very unique tool with Esri, the software, where we have layered these communities comments, these maps, these 1,000 maps that Kay talked about, and you can see a gradient of where those communities are the most important. And so as the commission is doing their fine tuning, looking at these maps, they're looking at that detail saying, the people are saying this is kind of an important area, so let's skirt around it and keep this whole. And I think that's important, but also probably the most critical now is looking at the maps, seeing which ones you like or don't like. This is your opportunity. Katie mentioned that November 1st, we're going to submit everything. And so we're done. We have about 5 weeks. And so the commission right now is finishing up some of the final maps, and now they're doing the refinement. We're doing public hearings throughout the state. We're coming to Salt Lake City next Friday evening. We have one in Harriman, and we're also going to West Valley. So those are the 3 meetings in Salt Lake County. And Salt Lake County is the most populous. Salt Lake City is the most populated city. Everything kind of stems here because it's going to be split. There's no question about it. But we ought to make those splits and the combinations in a way that we're getting from feedback from the residents, from people. And the more feedback we get and the more feedback the legislature gets, the more likely we can get maps that give people a voice and strengthen democracy.
And just reiterating again, so the Independent Redistricting Commission will be at Swazo Business Center this Friday, October 1st, from 6 to 9 p.m. So Salt Lake City residents can head to that community hub and provide your feedback and, give these comments that we're talking about. Do you want Salt Lake City's districts to stretch to Park City, or do you think, how they are is just fine? So this is another really important opportunity. So you can register to vote today, and then you can head to the Swazo Business Center on Friday to see Salt Lake City's maps being drawn. But
I think everything Gordon said is absolutely right. And one of the things, though, I would think would be important is really to look at, and I keep going back to this, but look at who has represented you, and if you feel that your interests or your community's interests and needs have been met or have been prioritized. And that's sort of going back to what Gordon said, is that community of interest, are you being prioritized equally or in a manner that makes sense to you and that district, or is it so not aligned with whoever else is being represented that we need to switch things around a little bit? And so I think as people are making those comments, to keep that in mind as well.
I've also found, listening to a lot of public comment, that when people are specific about which type of district, you kind of get down to more practical nitty-gritty stuff. So you might have a different opinion of how your state house district should look like versus, the national level at Congress. And so I would actually, of course, as other people said, like, refamiliarize yourself with that and think about the different types of map. State school board is something that I think, the commission and the committee are looking for more input on, but people feel differently about how they're represented on these different maps. And so maybe think about that when you're making public input as well, giving public input.
And maybe just one more thing to kind of think about. We've been doing most of our hearings lately out in the rural parts of Utah. And so, for example, Moab was split 3 ways, and their comments were very clear. We do not want to be split that way. We're only a population of 10,000, but because we're split 3 ways, the likelihood of ever electing an official from there during a decade worth of elections is minimal. And so they were asking, keep us whole and put us with other communities to get to the 40,000 for a state house representative. And during that decade, there's a 0.25% chance or 25% chance that somebody will be elected from their community. We heard the same thing from Tooele. Their representation all comes from Salt Lake County because of the way the boundaries were done. So once these boundaries are selected in November, this will be the next decade, and it will define where your representatives will be coming from. And we heard this from lots of cities all throughout. Everywhere we've gone we feel more comfortable if we get better usage of our legislatures if they're from our community. And so again, Salt Lake City may have a better representation, having more representing them from outside communities, but that's something that we want to hear from Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County to see how they feel, because that was a rural perspective, and now we need the urban perspective.
I also don't know if anyone has kind of a sense, but this is another question from Facebook from Chelsea, but what is being prioritized? Is it, or even in the past or even moving forward, but has rural communities and their representation been more prioritized versus urban areas? And like, what do the lines currently look like? And another question is like, what do Salt Lake City school board districts look like? Because I am not familiar with that. So that would be another interesting point to touch on. So first question, what is being prioritized, rural or urban interest? And then what do our school districts look like, school boundaries look like?
When we talk to the rural, they feel like the urban areas are being prioritized. When we talk to the urban, they feel like no. So I think there's always a balance. And I don't think there is a clear definition. We do know that rural Utah is struggling economically, it's losing population, and they have a lot of needs and interests. We know that urban is growing, is blowing up, whether you're in St. George along the Wasatch Front, they have need for new infrastructure. And as Katie mentioned earlier, over the next decade, there's going to, or maybe it was you mentioned earlier, somebody, that there's going to be billions of dollars spent, policies, laws made, and they're going to do a lot of things over that next decade. And so this is a chance to help form how those policies and dollars are going to be set up. And so your school board is, we're seeing this last with the pandemic and all the issues that have risen, how critical, there's important decisions that are going to be made on school board levels, congressional, every level. So when you're talking about elected officials, city councils, everybody, they are going to start, putting policies in place. And it's really important to be aware at this grassroots level, the very base level, setting these district lines, how that goes forward in the future.
Yeah, and I would say, again, the Independent Commission has a list of standards or criteria that they must balance. They are not prioritized. beyond the fact that, of course, they have to honor the one person, one vote, because that's a constitutional requirement. So that is obviously like the top, that has to be upheld. But then all the other criteria that we've discussed, keeping cities and communities and counties intact when possible, communities of interest, they have to figure out how to balance that. And that's part of the art. And I think that broader conversation that we've had historically in Utah is that, should the bigger districts, so I think you would point to state school board and congressional districts, be a mix of urban and rural, or should it not? That philosophical direction must come from the people, not from the commission, but from what they hear from the people. And that certainly is being debated. And I would just recommend that people weigh in on what they think is best in terms of that big question mark, because we are, a unique state in terms of having a high concentration of people in a small area, and then a huge geographic area that's really sparsely populated. We can't ignore that. That is our reality. And so how do you shape districts around that? It's not simple or straightforward. And so I think the commission and the legislative committee need to hear from, Utahns on their feelings on that.
My other question too is, so the Independent Redistricting Commission has all these great standards in place to prevent gerrymandering. Why wouldn't the legislature adopt their maps? Is there something on the legislative side, like some policies that they're considering? But why wouldn't our state legislatures accept these maps that are being drawn, that are, bipartisan, and taking all these, community feedback and input?
I think they're going to adopt them. No, I'm very optimistic. So one of the things that the predecessor to Katie talked about, Mr. Rosenberg, he said, I was talking to him, it was not going to be likely he was going to get the 190 signatures to get it on the ballot. It wasn't likely that he was going to get the initiative done or even passed. But he said, if you're not doing something that's impossible, then maybe you should think about what you're doing. And I think we're in that mode. I think these are going to be great maps. This is an opportunity for the commission or for the legislature to receive maps that represent the people. And I think that will give them an opportunity to really look at them and have that feedback from the people on how these maps can be put together. So our hope is, again, that we have enough public input, that the state legislature committee has as much input, and they can see that, yes, this is what the people are asking to do. They've been elected by the people. I believe that they want to represent the people. They're good people. They work hard. So I think the legislature has a desire to follow what the people are asking them to do.
Thank you, Gordon. One other follow-up question from Chelsea too is, and I think this kind of speaks to, like, maybe if you could explain what the community of interest maps are, but how are areas being grouped together? For instance, is the Independent Redistricting Commission looking at keeping communities together, cities such as Moab? What is the priority for an Independent Redistricting Commission?
Cities are important, counties are important. When you listen to a city, we'll have a mayor come and talk to us and say, we've really struggled. We have representation, but we don't seem to be getting the traction we need. We need to be kept together. And so when we hear that, we feel like those elected officials have knocked the doors, walked the neighborhoods, and have an understanding of their people. And then when we hear from their public similar sentiments, that gives us good direction. As far as communities of interest, it's a fairly new term in districting. And so the way the commission has determined to do that is to allow the public to define their own community of interest. So there's no preset that it has to be ethnic, or it has to be economic, or it has to be some social, it basically, we're letting people define and say whether they are or not. And we're accepting that. That's what they say their community of interest is, and that's what we'll agree they believe it is. And then we're going to try to work with it as we do the mapping. We're not going to sit back and try to define what isn't or is the community of interest. The public is to decide that. Hopefully that answered the question. So.
One other question too is, what is the likelihood of Salt Lake City being kept together as much as possible? And I would like everyone just to provide some feedback on what they would like to see Salt Lake City's maps to look like, or just based off of, you know, the data that we got from the census, what should they look like? If everyone could just take a moment to one, say what they'd like the new maps to look like, or what they should look like.
I can be kind of definitive. All 6 teams, or all 3 teams in all their maps, have essentially kept Salt Lake City together in the congressional. There's maybe a slight sliver here or there, but I'd say it's 98% kept together in all the maps. The question is, does it get paired north, east, west, south, more rural? Those are the questions that are coming up. Now, when it comes to Senate, it's a little more creative. When it comes to state Senate, state House even gets more creative. So you're going to see some where all the Senate seats are in the city and some moved around. So you have more representatives, but maybe fewer inside the city. And the school district, I've seen the same thing. You get split in a couple different ways. So, and sometimes I've seen it as completely whole. So the maps, like I said, all have something you can absolutely grab hold of and say, we like it, or we don't like that. So.
Council Chair Fowler, what would you like to see Salt Lake City's new maps to look like?
I was purposefully being quiet on this question, Haley, because it's a difficult one, I think, in a lot of ways. You know, I think what I would like to see is to make sure that we, you know, Salt Lake City is just generally more liberal, more sort of outgoing, if you will, in a lot of ways than other communities. And I would want to make sure that that voice is not diluted. And so I think, to Gordon's point, that Salt Lake City would sort of have to be split up in different ways and creatively, with at least at the state level. I would want to make sure that in any way we still have a strong voice as a city being represented in the state, if that makes sense. And so I think that to me is the most important part, is just making sure that our residents' voices aren't diluted.
Katie or Mallory, would you like to add any data to be considered, or ideas of what Salt Lake City?
Yeah, I'm not a resident, so I'm not going to weigh in. I guess my hope is that that you know, the voices of the people are reflected in the final map, and that the process is honored. And that, I think that's what Better Boundary wishes, you know, across the whole state and every community.
Great, I know that's a tough question, but I think some people, I mean, I feel get discouraged or you know, disillusioned with politics, and voting districts. I think everyone probably knows the term gerrymandering, but it is, you know, being able to understand the process a little bit better, and an easy way to participate in this process is showing up. It's a really good opportunity that, you know, there's a space on the west side of Salt Lake that community members can go to, can walk to, that they can, you know, interact with the commission to provide their feedback and make sure, you know, their voices are heard. So it's a good opportunity. There's also ways, and we can share this on our chat section, how to submit comments online if you can't be there in person. Gordon, would you be able to speak to how folks can attend in person on Friday, or submit their questions online?
Yeah, so the meeting will be live, but we'll also have people can participate virtually. They can we'll send out a link that they can comment in, and we can let them speak to the commission, or we can just email them answers depending on how somebody wants to participate. We will have maps that we can bring up so people can have specific questions and point and show us exactly what their comments are and what they would like, how they would like to see the future of districting. And I think gerrymandering is interesting. I don't think there's necessarily an intent to gerrymander, but I think it's always what is your motivation for drawing this line? What is causing you to do this? Is it politically motivated, or are you thinking about the people? Because when you look at some of these maps, if the commission's really thinking about the people, they have some interesting shapes too. It's not that it's a shape issue. It's more of how are we trying to get the representation? And a lot of our problems is some of the city limits are very gerrymandered. I'll tell you, Salt Lake City is great because it's a nice rectangle, but that's not true throughout the state. There are some really bizarre shapes, and when the commission's trying to keep them all, you'll look at that and say, well, what in the world? Then you pull up the layer that shows city limits or county. You say, okay, I get what they were trying to do here to accomplish this task. So I think everybody wants this same result, that we've strengthened people's voices, that they can be heard, that the elections can represent the needs of the people, that whatever we need happening over the next decade get to happen. And I'm a bureaucrat, so I'll talk too long, so I better back it down a little bit.
Thank you, Gordon. This also reminds me, Mallory, if you could talk about how people can see the new demographic and census data of Salt Lake City. The Kempsey Gardner has a great website that helps visualize this data.
Yeah, if you go to gardner.utah.edu, we have a 2020 page that has a little tool that you can kind of look at the race and ethnicity data. The Census Bureau also has a lot of great visualizations on their page that lets you kind of look at your neighborhood a little more and the different racial and ethnic makeup. So there's a lot of resources out there to kind of get your arms around the data a little bit more if you want that background before you give your comments.
Yeah, folks can do a deep dive into the census data and then be prepared to go to Swazo Business Center on Friday to provide that feedback. But we are wrapping up. If anyone would like to provide one final call to action to have people participate, either engage with the Independent Redistricting Commission or the legislature or even city council, like if anyone would like to provide a final call to action, now's your chance.
We are really excited to have people attend the meeting this Friday. Like I said, we have 2 more in Salt Lake County, but I think if you could attend this meeting and give us feedback, I think we sent Haley some information that you guys can post and push out about the meeting. And if you can't attend, you can still call our staff directly. If people want map drawing parties, we will have staff that can go out and meet with people, talk with them. We have a lot of ways that people can be involved in this. And so give us your input, give the state legislature your input, help us both create maps that really represent the people of Utah today.
And I would just say after that, remember that your voice counts in the city as well. And to stay active and stay involved during our process so that we, as a city, as a more local entity, can really reflect the interests of our communities and make sure that we're listening. And I'm just going to give a quick shout out to our own council staff who helped me prepare for this topic, but really are so knowledgeable that if people have questions, please reach out to Salt Lake City Council and our staff and me, and we can make sure that questions are answered as well as we move forward with our process.
Yeah, and all I'll add is the commission's really looking for comments on those draft maps. So we hope you'll consider that. And at betterboundaries.org, we have ways to get involved, and we're updating it frequently. We, of course, are looking for volunteers for our statewide grassroots organizing effort. And we have a podcast that you can log in and listen as the process unfolds to keep up to date. And thank you for this opportunity. And I'm really grateful to the city of Salt Lake.
Thank you all so much for providing your feedback today, and thank you for tuning in. Register to vote today in 2030, complete the census, but please show up on Friday and provide your feedback. Salt Lake City, we want everybody's voices to be heard, and we want our city to be fairly represented, so engage with the process. Thank you, everybody.